It was early fall when my sister left, and I remember the light in the house felt different after she was gone, like the warmth had somehow drained away. I'd grown up idolizing her in that way younger siblings do, watching her move through the world with this quiet strength and grace that made me feel like she had everything figured out. When we were kids, she was the one who taught me how to sneak cookies from the jar without getting caught. Who warned me about what I could and couldn't say to Mom, and who defended me. Even when she was the one being reprimanded, she was my guide in the mysterious world of childhood, and even into my teens. I never lost that feeling that she knew things I couldn't yet understand. Our house was a quiet one. My parents weren't the type to show a lot of emotion, at least not in a way that was easy to read. They loved us, I knew that, but their love was soft and almost muted. Something felt in the steady beat of routine rather than in any outward display. We had our dinners together every night, a steady rotation of Mom's recipes, and my dad's Saturday pancakes, which tasted a little different each week depending on what he remembered to add to the batter. But my sister, she was different. Her silence held something else, a kind of weight that felt heavier, even sad at times, and maybe that was why my parents never questioned it. I always figured that was just how she was, and we had grown up in that quiet understanding, with me filling in the spaces around her with my chatter. But as I got older, I noticed things that didn't quite fit. There were times I'd catch her sitting alone, staring at nothing in particular, her eyes distant, her whole body tense. I'd ask her what was wrong, and she'd just smile, that faint, practiced smile that told me everything and nothing at once. She was good at pretending, at keeping her sadness wrapped up like a gift she'd never open. A box she'd learned to keep safely out of reach. Even when I'd press, she'd brush it off, telling me not to worry, that it was just a phase, or one of those days. I believed her, even when I knew better. The day she left for boarding school, my parents sat me down in the living room. I remember Mom's face, pale and drawn, as if she'd spent the night awake, eyes red-rimmed but determinedly calm. Dad did most of the talking, though he looked just as uncomfortable as I felt. He explained in short sentences, as if he wanted to get the words out as quickly as possible. My sister needed some time away, he said, at a special school where she'd get the help she needed. He didn't specify what kind of help, and when I asked, he looked at Mom, who shook her head slightly. She needs space. My mom finally said, her voice barely a whisper, "It's best for her, honey." It didn't feel best for anyone. The silence that settled in after my sister left was different, a hollow kind of quiet that I hadn't felt before. I'd walk into her room sometimes, expecting to feel her presence lingering, but it was like she'd been erased. My parents wouldn't let me ask questions, and I could feel the tension tightening every time I tried. When I asked if I could visit her, my dad's face closed off like a door, and my mom would only say that it wasn't allowed right now. The vagueness left me frustrated and helpless, as if the people I'd always trusted to tell me the truth were suddenly strangers. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself drifting, walking through school in a daze. It was hard to concentrate on math or history or what my friends were talking about in the lunchroom. I'd scroll through old photos on my phone, pictures of the two of us with arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with sunburned noses and tangled hair. I'd lie in bed at night replaying every conversation we'd ever had, searching for signs that I'd missed, clues that might explain why she was gone. The curiosity gnawed at me, a constant ache that wouldn't let go. There were too many gaps, too many strange pieces that didn't fit. I started spending more time in her room, hoping to find something she might have left behind. A note, a message, anything that would explain what had happened. Her room was like a ghost town, untouched since the day she left. Her bed still neatly made, her favorite blanket folded at the foot, and her books stacked on the nightstand in their usual uneven tower. One afternoon, when my parents were out running errands, I took my time exploring every corner, feeling almost like a trespasser in her absence. I sifted through her desk drawers, flipping through notebooks and sketchpads filled with half-finished drawings, some whimsical, others strangely dark. I found a small box under her bed, filled with things I hadn't seen before: a worn-out friendship bracelet, a pressed flower, a handful of loose photographs of places I didn't recognize. And then, there it was, a small folded piece of paper tucked into one of her journals. The handwriting was hers, looping and slanted, and it said simply, "Don't ask, don't look back." The words sent a chill through me, a warning that felt both urgent and cryptic. Why wouldn't she want me to ask? What was so bad that she had to leave? And why couldn't I know? I felt like I was piecing together a puzzle, but every new piece only made the picture blurrier. After that, I couldn't stop searching. My parents were growing more withdrawn, their faces tight with some emotion they didn't want me to see. I'd hear them talking in low voices at night, their tones hushed and tense, like they were afraid the walls might hear them. Sometimes, I'd catch my mother crying quietly in the kitchen, her back to me, shoulders shaking as she held onto the counter for support. Other times, I'd find my dad pacing in the garage, muttering under his breath as though lost in a conversation with himself. At dinner, the silence felt like an accusation, heavy and unyielding. I tried to fill it with questions, but my parents only exchanged wary looks and told me to focus on school. Their responses were robotic, rehearsed, as if they'd practiced shutting me out. I couldn't understand why they wouldn't let me in, why they were treating me like a child who couldn't handle the truth. My sister and I had been close as two people could be, and now it felt like they were erasing her from our lives. One night, as I lay in bed, I overheard a conversation that shook me. My parents were talking in the hall, their voices barely above a whisper, but I caught fragments, words that left me with more questions than answers. We did what we had to, my dad was saying, his voice taut with barely suppressed anger. It was for the best. My mom replied, though she didn't sound convinced. But what about? Dad's voice trailed off, and then silence. For the best. That phrase haunted me. What did they mean by that? And why did it feel like they were trying to convince themselves as much as me? The days felt longer after that night. Each moment, each glance, each word my parents said or didn't say seemed layered with some hidden meaning. I became hyper-aware of everything, picking up on details I would have otherwise ignored. My mother's distant gaze as she stirred her tea. The way my dad would hesitate before answering my questions. Their silences, once comfortable, now felt loaded, like they were afraid something would slip out. And so, I started looking for answers on my own. Late one night, I sat at the computer in the study and typed in boarding schools for troubled teens. The results that came up weren't what I expected. These schools were institutions with names like treatment centers or behavioral health programs. They used words like intervention, rehabilitation, therapy. I felt a sick feeling in my stomach as I read descriptions that sounded more like prisons than schools. Locked doors, 24-hour surveillance, controlled phone calls and monitored visits. The thought of my sister, with her quiet resilience, locked away in a place like that, it didn't fit. It felt like trying to picture a bird in a cage, its wings clipped. I scrolled through page after page, feeling a sense of dread settling over me. I hadn't found her exact location, but I knew enough to understand that this boarding school wasn't what my parents had tried to make it out to be. The next day, I tried searching for clues at home again. There was a part of me that felt guilty, like I was betraying my family somehow, but the need to know was stronger. I needed to know why my sister, who had been a constant, if sometimes distant, presence in my life, had been sent away without explanation. In my dad's office, I found an old, unlocked filing cabinet filled with papers and receipts. My hands shook as I sifted through them, not really knowing what I was looking for, but hoping something would jump out at me. And it did. There, among the bills and documents, was a manila folder labeled with my sister's name. I opened it, holding my breath, and found papers I barely understood: medical records, evaluation forms, and a series of emails between my parents and a place called Havenbrook Institute. The emails mentioned terms like treatment options, behavioral assessment, and risk factors. The words blurred together as I tried to make sense of them. My heart pounding, I sat back, stunned, the pieces clicking together in a way that made me feel both furious and helpless. My sister hadn't been sent to a boarding school. She'd been sent to a mental health facility. And my parents had lied to me about it. It was like a punch to the gut, realizing that my sister had been struggling in ways I hadn't fully understood. And that my parents had hidden it from me. The anger was mixed with a sharp pang of guilt. Had I missed something? Had she tried to reach out to me, and I'd ignored the signs? In the days that followed, I became obsessed with Havenbrook Institute. I spent every spare moment researching it, looking up any information I could find online. The website was clinical, cold, filled with stock photos of smiling teenagers in well-lit rooms. A stark contrast to the descriptions I'd read in online forums. Former residents, or people who claimed to be, posted stories of strict routines, minimal outside contact, and a sense of isolation that left some of them feeling broken. The more I read, the more my anger grew. My parents had sent her there, hoping it would somehow fix her. But at what cost? I remembered her last weeks at home, how withdrawn she had become, how her once bright spirit had dimmed. I wondered if she had known what they were planning, if she had sensed that they were sending her away to be treated. The thought made me feel sick. I decided I needed to talk to someone, anyone who might understand. I thought about reaching out to friends, but they wouldn't understand, and the few I'd confided in had only given me sympathetic nods and awkward silence. Eventually, I settled on my favorite teacher, Ms. Carter, who had always seemed to notice when I was having a rough day. She had a way of making everyone feel seen, and I thought, maybe, she'd listen. I stayed after class one day, waiting for the last students to leave, and then approached her. I didn't say much, just that my sister was gone, that my parents had sent her somewhere without telling me the whole truth, and that I was left alone, struggling to understand why. Ms. Carter's expression softened, and she placed a hand on my shoulder. Sometimes, parents do things they think are best, she said, her voice gentle, but that doesn't mean it's easy for those left behind. She didn't offer me answers, but the empathy in her eyes made me feel, for the first time, like I wasn't completely alone in this. When I got home that night, I felt a renewed determination. I knew that the answers I needed weren't going to come from anyone else, I'd have to find them on my own. So, I went back to my dad's office, this time carefully scanning the documents I'd found, looking for any contact information, a name, a phone number, anything that could lead me to my sister. After hours of searching, I found it, a brief note from Havenbrick with an emergency contact number. A name scribbled in blue ink. My pulse quickened. I didn't think about the consequences. I just dialed, listening as the phone rang, half hoping no one would answer. A voice finally picked up. Cool and professional. Havenbrick Institute. How may I help you? I stumbled over my words, feeling suddenly out of my depth. I am calling about my sister, I said, my voice shaking. She was admitted a few months ago. And I just need to know if she's okay. There was a pause, and I could hear the faint clacking of a keyboard. I'm sorry, but without proper authorization, I can't provide information on any patient. The voice replied, as polite and unyielding as a locked door. Please, I whispered, desperate now, I just need to know if she's all right. The voice softened, just a fraction. If you have concerns, I suggest speaking with your parents. I hung up, feeling defeated, the sound of the dial tone ringing in my ears. They wouldn't tell me anything. I was back where I started, stuck with nothing but questions and half-truths. The night after my failed call to Havenbrick, I lay awake, replaying the words over and over, without proper authorization. That line, delivered so flatly, as if I were just another barrier to their rules, filled me with a deep, simmering anger. It wasn't fair. I had the right to know. She was my sister, my own flesh and blood, and yet they were keeping her locked away in a place that felt like it had swallowed her whole. The fact that no one else seemed willing to give me answers made it clear I'd have to get them myself. The next day, I waited for the right moment. It was after dinner, in the brittle silence of the kitchen, when my parents were clearing the table. The air was thick with unspoken things, as it had been since my sister left, and the words I'd been holding back felt like they were pushing against my ribs, demanding to be released. I took a breath, steadying myself, and finally said, I know she's not at a boarding school. The room froze, and both of them turned to look at me. My mom's face went pale, and my dad's mouth pressed into a hard line. She's at a place called Havenbrick, isn't she? I continued, my voice shaking but steady. It's not a school, it's a treatment facility. You lied to me. My mother looked down, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. My dad met my gaze, his expression unreadable, but behind his eyes, I could see the struggle, the weight of whatever he was holding back. We didn't want you to worry, he said finally, his voice low and measured. Your sister, she needed help. More help than we could give her here. I couldn't hold back my anger any longer. So you just sent her away, without even telling me, without giving me a chance to say goodbye. We did what we thought was best. My mother whispered, her voice thick with tears she was trying to hold back. You don't understand what it was like, watching her struggle every day, seeing her fade in front of us. Then why didn't you tell me? My voice rose, echoing through the silent kitchen. I'm her sister. I had a right to know. My dad put a hand on my shoulder, and I shook it off, too furious and hurt to accept his attempt at comfort. We wanted to protect you, he said. We thought it would be easier for you this way. Easier? I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and unfamiliar in my own ears. Do you have any idea how it feels to have your sister disappear and to be left in the dark? To have everyone act like she doesn't exist? For a moment, no one spoke. My mom was crying silently, her face turned away, and my dad looked down at the floor, his expression filled with a sadness that, for the first time, I understood was as much for him as it was for her. We didn't know what else to do. He said quietly, your sister was in pain. Real, deep pain that we couldn't fix. Havenbrick was supposed to help her, give her a chance to heal. We thought. He stopped, his voice breaking, and I saw for the first time how deeply this had affected them both. We thought she'd come back. I stood there, my anger beginning to dissolve into something else, something closer to grief. I realized then that I wasn't the only one who felt like a piece of my sister had been taken. My parents were hurting, too, and their choices, however misguided, had come from a place of desperation and fear. But the need to see her, to know for myself that she was okay, was still there, stronger than ever. I couldn't let them keep her hidden from me. Not anymore. I made up my mind that night, determined to take matters into my own hands. A week later, I found myself on a bus headed toward Havenbrick. I'd saved up every bit of allowance and birthday money I could find, enough to cover the bus fare to the next town over. The ride was long, the scenery passing by in a blur of muted greens and browns, and my stomach twisted with both anticipation and fear. I hadn't told my parents. I knew they'd try to stop me, to convince me that I didn't need to go, that it was best to wait. But I couldn't wait any longer. I had to see her. When I arrived, the building loomed in front of me, cold and clinical, with walls that looked too clean, too white. It was the kind of place that seemed to scrub away any trace of individuality. A place built to contain rather than comfort. My heart pounded as I walked up to the front desk, feeling like a trespasser in this sterile, unfamiliar world. A receptionist looked up, smiling in a way that felt almost forced. "How can I help you?" "I'm here to see my sister," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I gave her my sister's name, hoping it would be enough. She glanced at her computer, typing quickly, her face impassive. After a moment, she looked back at me, her expression softening just slightly. "I'm afraid she's not here anymore." I felt the ground shift beneath me. "What do you mean? Where is she?" "She was transferred to another facility out of state," she replied, the words sharp and final. "I'm sorry, but without family authorization, I can't give you any more details." I stood there, stunned, feeling a wave of frustration and helplessness crash over me. After everything, after all the secrecy and lies, I'd come this far only to be told that she was somewhere else. Somewhere I couldn't reach. I left the building, feeling more lost than ever. As I walked down the street, the weight of everything pressed down on me. She was gone, farther away than before, and the answers I'd been searching for felt even more out of reach. But despite the disappointment, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. Maybe it was knowing that I'd tried, that I hadn't given up on her. The days following my visit to Havenbrick were a blur of emotions I could barely name. I felt raw, like a wound that wouldn't stop aching. There was disappointment, of course, after all the build-up, the planning, the long bus ride. I hadn't found what I'd been searching for, but there was also relief. In a strange way, I'd finally seen the place my sister had been sent, the cold and clinical walls that had swallowed her up. I'd taken steps, and somehow, even though I hadn't been able to see her, it made me feel a little less powerless. At home, things were different. My parents seemed to sense a shift in me, a calm they hadn't seen before. They didn't ask where I'd gone that day, though I was sure they knew, or at least suspected. We'd fallen into an unspoken understanding, a sort of fragile truce where they allowed me space to come to terms with everything I'd learned. And I stopped pressing them for answers they didn't have. It wasn't easy. The house still felt empty, haunted by her absence, but the sharpness of my anger began to dull. I started to see my parents through new eyes, to understand the heaviness they'd been carrying. They were grieving, too, in their own way, even though they'd chosen a path that had cost us all. Sometimes I'd lie in bed, replaying old memories, little snippets of moments we'd shared. I remembered her laughter on summer nights, the way she'd braid my hair before school, her hands gentle and patient, even if we were running late. Those memories felt like gifts now, tiny fragments of her that I could hold onto, pieces of her spirit that couldn't be taken away. One evening, my dad came into my room and sat down on the edge of the bed. Something he hadn't done in years. He looked older, worn down in a way that made me see him as someone more human, more fragile, than I'd ever allowed myself to believe. "You're a lot like her. You know," he said softly. "She'd always tell us how proud she was of you, how much she believed in you." The words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I'd been focused on the secrets, the lies, the sense of betrayal, but hearing that, knowing she believed in me, even in her darkest moments, brought me a strange, unexpected peace. We sat there in silence, a comfortable, shared silence, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to fill it with questions or accusations. I understood, finally, that they'd done what they could, and that it hadn't been enough, not for her, and not for me, but somehow, accepting that felt like the first step toward healing. The months went by, and I found myself slowly adjusting to a new kind of normal. The ache was still there, a quiet, constant presence, but it had softened, settling into the background like a familiar song. My friends noticed the change, of course. I wasn't the same person I'd been before my sister left. But somehow, that felt okay. I was different, yes, but I was also stronger. I channeled my feelings into writing, pouring my thoughts onto paper in late-night sessions at my desk. It was easier to process everything that way, to see the emotions laid out in ink, messy and imperfect, but mine. I wrote about my sister, about the memories that brought me joy and those that made my heart ache. I wrote about the things I wished I could tell her, letters to a person who might never read them but who felt close. Somehow, in those quiet moments, one afternoon, I found myself walking through the park where we used to spend summer days as kids. I sat on the bench where we'd once eaten ice cream, her arm slung casually over my shoulder as we laughed about something silly, and for a moment, I could almost feel her beside me. It was strange, but I felt a sense of comfort, as if a part of her was still with me, even if she was far away. In time, I began volunteering at a local organization that supported mental health awareness. It felt like a way to honor her, to turn my grief into something meaningful, talking to other people who had experienced similar losses, who had struggled with the complexities of mental illness, made me feel less alone. It gave me a purpose. A sense that maybe, just maybe, I could help others in ways that I hadn't been able to help her. My parents started to open up, too, in small but significant ways. We'd talk about her sometimes, remembering the good times, allowing ourselves to laugh and smile and cry without the tension that had once hung between us. Those conversations became a balm, a way of keeping her spirit alive in our hearts, of acknowledging that even though she was gone, she was still a part of us. The pain never fully went away, and maybe it never would, but I learned to carry it with me, to let it be a reminder of the love I'd had for her. A love that was strong enough to survive even her absence. I learned that grief isn't something you move on from, it's something you grow around. A scar that softens but never truly fades. One day, months after I'd last seen her, I received a letter from the facility where my sister was now staying. The letter was short, clinical, written by someone I'd never met, but it held something precious, a small update on her progress, a note that she was stable, that she was being taken care of. It wasn't the reunion I'd dreamed of. There was no promise of a homecoming, no assurance that she'd be back with us any time soon, but knowing she was safe, that she was alive and being cared for, gave me a kind of closure I hadn't realized I needed. In that moment, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that allowed me to breathe a little easier. My sister's journey was her own, filled with battles I might never understand, but I knew now that I didn't have to understand everything to love her, to carry her with me in my heart. There's a particular kind of calm that comes with accepting what you can't change. It doesn't mean the pain disappears or that the questions lose their sting. It means you learn to live alongside them, to hold them as part of who you are. In the months after my sister's departure, that calm settled over me, like the feeling of a warm coat on a chilly day. It was a quiet acceptance, not a surrender, but a willingness to carry what I'd been given, even if it was heavy. In time, life found its rhythms again. I returned to school, my grades steadied, and I began to reconnect with friends. They noticed, of course, the ways I'd changed, the way I no longer laughed as easily, but they were gentle with me, meeting me where I was rather than trying to push me forward. They helped me remember the parts of life that were still bright, the small, simple joys of warm coffee, bike rides, and shared jokes. At home, things felt different, too. My parents and I didn't talk about her every day, but we didn't avoid her memory anymore, either. Sometimes, when the silence grew heavy, one of us would mention something she'd loved, a song, a favorite movie, a memory of her terrible attempts at baking, and we'd laugh, not because it didn't hurt, but because it reminded us of the life she'd brought into ours. These little moments stitched us back together, slowly, like old fabric mended by careful hands. I continued volunteering, throwing myself into the work with a purpose I hadn't known before. I shared my story with others who had lost siblings or family members to mental health struggles. And in that sharing, I found a sense of community, of people who understood the depth of a loss that couldn't be fully defined. I realized that my sister's journey wasn't a failure, that her struggles hadn't made her any less of the person I loved. She had been brave in ways I hadn't understood, and by carrying that love forward, I could honor her in ways words alone couldn't capture. Then, one gray afternoon, as I was sifting through the mail, I found another letter from the facility where she'd been transferred. It was short, straightforward, much like the last one. They wrote that she was still in treatment, that she was stable but unlikely to be released soon. It wasn't the news I'd once longed for, but somehow, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. I sat down with the letter, reading it again, the words sinking in. I could feel her absence deeply in that moment, yet there was a gentleness in my grief. I understood now that her path was her own, that her struggles weren't something I could fix or control. She had fought hard, harder than I'd known, and in many ways, so had we all. As I looked out the window, watching the leaves fall in slow spirals, I thought about the lessons she taught me, not just in her absence, but in the life we'd shared. She'd shown me the quiet strength it took to face each day, the courage in vulnerability, and the value of compassion for those who walk a harder path. And even though she wasn't there beside me, I felt her presence as something gentle and lasting, like a memory woven into the fabric of who I was. Life moved forward, as it always does, and I found myself growing into someone I hoped she'd be proud of. I continued writing, pouring my experiences into words that connected me to others who needed to hear that they weren't alone. I spoke at gatherings for mental health awareness, sharing my story not out of sadness, but from a place of strength and empathy, hoping that in some small way, it might make a difference. There were days when the ache of missing her was sharp, like a fresh wound, and other days when it felt softer, like a familiar song playing quietly in the background. I learned to carry both the pain and the love, understanding that they were inseparable parts of what she'd left behind. And though I didn't know if she would ever come back, I knew that I'd found a way to carry her with me, to keep her spirit alive in the choices I made, the kindness I offered, and the strength I found within myself. Her journey was her own, filled with battles I couldn't fight for her, but I knew now that loving her didn't mean trying to change her path, it meant honoring her courage. her resilience, and the quiet beauty she'd brought into my life. The journey hadn't ended the way I'd once hoped, but I understood now that closure didn't always mean answers. Sometimes, it meant finding peace within the unresolved, letting go of what we couldn't know and holding close to what we did. My sister's story was one of struggle, yes, but also of deep, unbreakable love, a bond that distance and time could never take away. As I looked out at the world, still filled with its mysteries and unknowns, I felt a quiet hope rise within me, a sense of possibility that I hadn't felt in a long time. I knew there would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt and sadness, but I also knew that I had the strength to face them. To keep moving forward with her memory as a source of strength and light. In the end, her journey became part of mine, shaping me in ways I hadn't chosen but had learned to embrace. I carried her love, her laughter, her spirit, not as a burden, but as a gift, a quiet, steady reminder that even in the midst of loss, life held beauty and purpose and the capacity for healing. And as I walked forward into the unknown, I felt her presence like a whisper, soft and constant, guiding me forward, her memory woven into every step.